Hi everyone, and welcome to week 2. I wanted to kind of go over UV mapping a little bit and then make sure you're all set for your homework that's due this week. We will be getting into sculpting next week, so it's important that we've got everything all set and ready to go for that. It is vital that you have your UVs set up in the modeling software before we bring it into Mudbox. Mudbox has its own way of doing things, but we're actually going to end up baking our textures, which is to kind of create a high poly sculpted model, create the texture on that, and then we're going to put it on our low poly model. So also important that we're kind of trying to do low poly modeling. I mentioned it in the discussion board, but make sure all of your edge loops are necessary. You know, if you're just kind of throwing in extra edge loops to add them in, you don't really need to do that. It needs to actually be shaping out your form. And also make sure that your edge loops are always actual loops. You never want it to just end at a vertice. We'll kind of go over some of that later, but I do want you to take a look at your actual milestone 1. So it says you need your orthographic views, your perspective views, your references, and your notes. You need all 4 of these things. And your orthographic views are actually your front and side view. So these are the ones that need to be done using a ruler, or your rulers in Photoshop. They need to match up. If you want to do more than just a front and side, you're welcome to. You can turn those in, but all I'm requiring are a front and side view. Then we have here your perspective view. Your perspective view is going to be a 3/4 view. Now this can be kind of difficult to draw, and we won't actually use it in the modeling software, but you're going to need it so that you can visualize what this is going to look like in 3D. We talk about concept art and how it's important. This is part of that. So you've got your front and side view and then a 3/4 view or perspective drawing. Then make sure to gather up any references. So you need to take a look at what's already out there, what's being designed of what you're trying to make. Check to see what's working, what's not, to kind of build your own. And then your reference notes. So talk about exactly what is this material going to be made from? Is this object going to be new, old? Is it going to be a toy? Is it, huge and made of rock that's decaying? So just start to think of all of the different things that are going to make up your actual prop or model or whatever you're making. Okay? So let's take a look in Maya. So we want to talk about unwrapping. What is unwrapping? So I kind of think of it as wrapping a Christmas present. You are taking a 2-dimensional design, photo, image, and you are wrapping it around a 3D shape. So, try to think if you have a basketball that you're trying to give someone for Christmas and you're wrapping it in paper, if you want the paper to be tight, what do we have to do to actually get it to go around a spherical surface? So in Maya, if you're in your modeling drop down here, you'll see UV. So if I click on UV, we've got a bunch of different options here. I'm going to go over kind of the basic ones. We'll get into a more texture-based class as you move forward. But for here, we want to look at automatic, cylindrical, planar, spherical. You can also do camera-based. That's just going to shine kind of your projection based upon which way your camera is facing. Automatic is semi-new, maybe like 5 years. But it's been really beneficial. The only issue is it really takes into account several views for making your unwrap. So let me slow down, rewind a little bit, and let's see what I'm talking about. I'm going to create my basketball here. Boop. All right. So, with this course, we're not going to be texturing in the modeling software. We're actually texturing in Mudbox. But just so you're aware, you can right mouse click and hold over the object and go to Assign New Material. All of these are your different types of materials. There are Maya materials, there are much more complicated materials, but we're just going to take a look at Blinn and Lambert. These are named after their creators. Blinn is a shiny kind of material. You'll get a highlight, as you can see on this kind of icon. Lambert is a matte, so glossy and matte. I'll just do a Lambert so that we can see. It's going to open up a new node in our attribute editor. And you can see we've got color here, so if I wanted to make it green, anything like that. But there's this checker box next to color, and when I click on that, you'll notice their checker box is all the way down, but this is where I can actually bring in an image file. So if you wanted to bring in something from like CG textures, if you took an image, you can grab the file here. I'm just going to do a checker box. Now, Jen, what happened? I don't see anything, but it shows it here. You just have to hit 6 on your keyboard. 6 is the hotkey to display your textures in the viewport. All right, so now we have our sphere. And if I go to UV and then UV editor, excuse me, I can see my texture is laid out here, and then I can see my UVs. So this little image here, it looks like mountains in the sun, hides and shows the texture that's on your object. I'm going to hide it temporarily so we can see what's going on here. I'm going to minimize this UV toolkit. Oops, not what I wanted to do. So, get this over here. All right. Your middle mouse roll wheel still does the same thing over here, same with your other controls. So these are your UVs. It's a little confusing at first, but basically a UV lines up with your vertices, but they only deal with texture. So for example, I'm going to click on a UV here. I'm going to hold Shift to select a few. So you'll see I've got these 4 right here. And I've got these 4, my gizmo is blocking them, but you can see, okay? So it looks like I have a vertice and a UV, but really I only have the UVs. So if I move these, I'm going to bring up our texture again so you can see, if I move, all I'm doing is moving the texture. Becomes a little trippy because it's pulling things around it, but you can see that if I move this over into a white square, now these are just in the white. Or if I move it completely into a black square, now this is covered in black, but it's bending the UV edges that are around it. Okay? So your UVs and moving these around will never affect your actual shape. So, you know, I could grab all of these, move, rotate, and scale. Hotkeys are still the same. I could scale these down, and all I'm doing is making the checker boxes larger, or I could scale it up, and I'm making them smaller. Now, looking at this UV editor, what you want is for all of your UVs to fit in this first square. I can move these over if I want, and you'll see it's duplicating here. It's just copying over. But for purposes of bringing into Mudbox, or if you were going to do ZBrush, Unreal, etc., you always want all of your UVs to fit inside this square. You may think like, well, what a small space. What if I have a lot? It's really all right, because when we're dealing with textures, you can make your textures actually really small in the space and then have them be actually a large sheet of texture. So you can cram a lot into a small space of the textures. It's not like this square is actually this size. All right, so now for actually our different unwrap options. So this is just our base, how a sphere comes unwrapped. I'm going to minimize this temporarily. So you can see we come to a point here. So if I click on this, I'll show you just kind of the basic one first. UV planer. Now, what a planer is, think of it like a projector in the classroom. So it is just shining your 2D texture straight onto a projector, which works really well if you have a flat surface. But if I were to stand in front of the projector, the image might look great on my stomach or maybe on my forehead, but as it bends to my sides or around my nose, you're going to get some stretching. So let me show you what I mean. When I do the planer, you'll see these options come up. My planer map is actually going from the top. You can always change that over and rotate. So, you know, if I wanted it to be there we go. Now it's projecting from the side. So, and you can always change the projection width and height. So if you wanted it to be smaller or bigger. But looking at this, you're like, oh, this looks great. Why wouldn't I do that? Well, if we turn to the side, you can see that stretching that I was talking about. It's going to look great from the back as well because that's where the planer map is. But again, we have stretching. So planer map works really well, again, if you kind of have a symmetrical object that's kind of flat. So maybe if you have a thin sword, you could project and then just work on your seams that are on the side. You also don't just have to do one map. So just because I've done a planer here, I can always look from the side, select the faces that I would like, and do a different map. Now this does take a little bit more effort because you have to kind of stitch them together and work to make it look seamless. That's kind of our role as a texture artist, if you will. We want to make things look real, and the second you see a seam or something stretching or something repeated, that's what ruins it for you. So if I do planer, and then we'll do it. Oh man. There we go. Sorry about that. You can see now I have this, and you can always use kind of these boxes on the side to change your scale. It's the same thing as projection height and width, but I can try to match that up to be the same size as those. So I have two maps here. So now if I right mouse click and hold and go into object mode, I can go to my UV editor. And now I have two separate UVs. Now here's something really important. These are overlapping UVs. Okay? If you bring this into Mudbox and we create texture, whatever is overlapping, you must have the same texture on both spots. So, for example, if I select these, because my UVs are overlapping, you can see, let me just do like this, that I've got all of these and then just this small section from my second unwrap. They will have to match whatever is right behind them. So these ones have to be the black square. So how do we fix that? You're going to right mouse click and hold and go to UV shell. I have two shells here since I did two separate planer maps. So I'm just going to move this one out of the way for right now. Move this one out of the way. It looks like I missed a face, so something to pay attention to. But all you're going to do is then make these fit inside our UV space, like so. Now these are no longer overlapping, and you don't have to worry about having the same texture. So now when I'm actually painting in Mudbox, all of these faces are free to be their own texture. This might not make 100% sense yet, so feel free to send me a message or let me know and we can kind of go over it even further. But you just want to make sure you don't have overlapping UVs. Okay? All right. So if I go into object mode, I'm going to select this. I'm going to take a look at Spherical. Now, what Spherical does, which you can kind of see by the gizmo, but it's a little confusing, it makes sure to go all the way around. Now, the only issue with this is you're going to see at the top and the bottom, we get some crazy, we come to kind of a weird swirl point. So depending upon what shape you're using, this may work really well for you, or you might need to do some additional mapping at the top and bottom. Generally, you'll want to start with what your base shape was. Of course, you won't just have a sphere. You know, you'll have faces that have been pulled and twisted and extruded, and, you know, you will have molded something from your shapes. But it's important to kind of remember what you started with. And then you can always, you know, say like, well, I started with a sphere. You can try starting with a spherical unwrap to see if that's helpful. Now, we can try, I mean, your cylindrical is going to be if you wanted to start with more of a cylindrical shape. You can see my unwrap here and what we've got going on here. Lastly, I'm going to go back into object mode. We have automatic. So what automatic does, I'll zoom out so you can see, it actually tries to view your shape from 6 different sides and then break up your unwrap from there. So you can see we have a lot of different shapes, and it's kind of, there aren't any overlapping, but sometimes this might get a little confusing as to all the different pieces. So you can see in our viewport where our seams are, and you can see how they're connected here. So just take a look at where these seams are occurring and think of what textures you're going to need to use, and if having a seam there is going to be an issue. Then you can kind of fill in with some planar maps or some cylindrical maps, whatever you want to do to make this easy for you to understand. Because you want to be able to look at this and know what you're looking at. You know, obviously we've got the top here and the bottom here, but you might not know what this piece is. Let's see if we can find it even. Here it is. So it's right over there along this seam. All right, so I would play around with making a few different shapes and just adding a checker box to it and seeing what the different unwraps really can do. You can always grab a texture too. Sometimes it's fun to play around with brick and see how that kind of works. It is similar to a checker box, so you'll get kind of to see the variety that your shape will have. So now we're going to be moving these into Mudbox. Luckily, these programs work together really well. So we can go to File and then Send to Mudbox. So I want to go into Object Mode first, click on this, and go File, Send to Mudbox, Send as New Scene. Make sure that you have your object selected. You'll see it's connected to Mudbox, and then it'll come into Mudbox. The cool thing with Mudbox, if you haven't used it before, it will give you any errors that it finds, and it'll show you where the errors are. So for this, it thinks we have a high valence vertex. Because we're doing low poly modeling in Maya, when we're bringing it into Mudbox, it thinks that we have way too many edges meeting at one vertice. So let's keep this mesh and see where it's talking about. You see I've got a point at the top and a point at the bottom. That's because it thinks that this has just too many edges. So we could always go in edge mode, double click, Control Delete to get rid of an edge with its vertices. Now, you might not necessarily want to do that. Maybe that was helpful for your shape. That's an error that you can actually be okay with having. There are other errors that you need to make sure you fix before we move forward. Some of the common ones, I'm going to delete this. Grab this cube. I'm going to give it some subdivisions. So a lot of times we're going to do an extrude, and sometimes you don't realize that you've done an extrude, but you haven't moved anything. So I've got this. I will do an extrude. Oh, I moved on. I hit extrude again, and then I moved that piece up. So without knowing it, I have more vertices at this one point than I think. How do I know that? Well, if I go to Display, Heads Up Display, and Polycount, you're going to get this display. What this tells you, and we're looking mainly at vertices and edges, but how many are in your entire scene, and then how many are in your selected shape, and then how many do you actually have selected. So if I had this, so now you can see the vertices, object mode here, the vertices on my cube here, I've got 192. There are 574 between the sphere and the cube, and I don't have any selected. Right mouse click and hold, I'm going to go to vertex. It's important that you actually click and drag around a vertice. That allows you to see if there are two in one spot. If I just click and let go, you're only grabbing whichever one is closest to the camera. Now, it's a little difficult because if I'm looking at something like this and I click and drag, you're like, oh my gosh, I have 7 vertices, but really I've just selected 7 different ones throughout my shape. So you have to find the right angle that works for each vertice. But if I look here and I click and drag, it shows that I have 2 selected. And you can look, I don't have anything in the bottom. That's because I did the extrude twice without knowing it. So if I were to click and let go and just grab that top vertice, you can see I've got extra information underneath. So this is an error that Mudbox is going to try to help you find. But to fix it, I'm just going to click and drag over it. I see that I have 2. And then I'm going to go to Edit Mesh, Merge to Center. And now it's just 1. Unfortunately, you're going to have to go around and do that throughout, but you can use hotkey G as in great. Oops. Let's hit the right button. Let's try it over here. Hotkey G as in great to redo your last action, and it brings it to 1. G. We're redoing the merge. So you'll need to do that all the way around. If you get any errors that you're not sure what they mean in Mudbox, feel free to send me a screenshot and your Fbx. We are going to be looking at Fbx objects, so let me tell you what those mean. So I'm going to go into object mode here. If you wanted to just import something into Mudbox without sending it over, you're going to want to export it as an Fbx. This is another way that we'll be posting throughout the term. But you want to go to File, Export All or Export Selection. I have that selected. So I can just do Cube Test. And the drop down here is going to be an Fbx export. Export selection. Fbx files are great because they can be opened in Maya, 3ds Max, and Mudbox. So we could do File, Import, and then grab that cube test. So we can see I've got an incomplete UV because I didn't apply UVs to that shape, the cube. I have some the mesh has faces where corners lie on the same line. So that one's because I didn't continue to merge all of my vertices around that shape. So keep this mesh. and you can see it's showing me where the errors are. This is just because I have two shapes here. You can always go to select and move, and we'll move this out of the way. All right. Another thing to just be aware of is scale. So sometimes when you bring things into Mudbox, look how tiny this is. You want to check your settings to check your scale, or make sure that your object in Maya is large enough to bring into Mudbox. You'll want in Mudbox for your shape to be about the size of the grid when we start to add details and painting with textures and with sculpting. Alrighty? So that's all I have for you right now. Again, feel free to let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a good week.